my name is Joanna Toro. I'm the Chief Educator here at the Maine State Museum, and currently we are in the Malaga Island Fragmented Lives exhibit, and I'm sitting next to Rob Sanford and Nate Hamilton. They are the archaeologists that excavated much of the artifacts that are displayed in the exhibit behind me. And today we're going to spend a few minutes interviewing them about the process that they took and the research that they did. And I'm going to leave right now, and we're going to ask them some questions and see what we can find out about this whole process and where some of the artifacts came from in the exhibit. So for our first question, what drew you to Malaga Island?
I'll leave that to you, Nate.
We started the archaeological work in Casco Bay in the late 1970s doing a survey of the bay. And in 1988-89, we had a grant from Maine Historic Preservation Commission to continue prehistoric archaeological survey. John Mosier, former graduate student of ANES and an employee over at Maine Historic Preservation Commission, acquired some photo documentation. Actually, the photograph behind us of John and Rosilla Eason and the children. And that photograph kind of guided us to the island. And it opened the question of the possibility of doing African-American archaeology in the state of Maine. And it was becoming more of a key issue in the late 80s, early 1990s. So that brought us there.
Okay, so once you were there, how difficult was it to get permission to conduct an archaeology excavation on the island?
I remember going up to your lab and showing you that article that I saw in the Portland Press Herald about the island being proposed, having a new purchaser of land trust.
The Casada family, Rick Casada, owned the island, and at the time that we were interested in the work out there, we had asked permission of him, and because of other considerations, he didn't grant us permission, but he subsequently sold the island to Maine Coast Heritage Trust for what was a really remarkable fair price. Rob brought the newspaper article up, and I'm like, okay, the door is now open. Maine Coast Heritage Trust owns the island, and I think it was later that day that we contacted them about the possibility of doing excavations and work there. And they were the ones that gave us permission. But that's standard fare to have permission before we do any field work.
I think it helped that I'm in the Department of Environmental Science as well, and Nathan is as an archaeologist primarily, the fact that we also were interested in the environmental aspects, because the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, their initial concern was primarily the role of the island as bird habitat, and when they saw that we had an environmental awareness and ethic that would apply to this archaeological work, I think they were less concerned about having us do some work on the island.
There was also an immediate commitment to long-term involvement with the public relative to the land trust. I think that was another important aspect in the stewards that they have that focus in on those types of sites. I'm pretty sure they didn't have as much knowledge of how big this would actually become in the local community in the region.
You mentioned your involvement with the public. Could you please describe to us what public archaeology is?
Well, this actually relates to the notion of working with the community and getting people to understand the role of archaeology, because archaeology is done to conserve, to save, to gather information from things that are going to be lost. The public, now sometimes these things belong to the public or are in the public trust, but what makes it public archaeology is this, putting forward what you do, inviting people out, showing them, doing lots of talks, explaining about things, sharing the information, having something that becomes exhibited in the Maine State Museum. So these are not something that's dug up and then stuck away somewhere and then the report is filed to somebody. This is a very public process.
I think one of the key elements for me, this is probably the essence of what I do, I teach at a public university. Archaeology is not a typical grade school or high school class that you take. So one of the key things for me is to create archaeological literacy and for people to understand and value the landscape landscape of Maine is mostly private property. And in that sense, what it does, it creates a literate group of people that can go forward and act on preservation and put priorities for what is or is not significant. This story, as a public element, had lots of journalism and lots of historic sources behind it. It was notorious. So in the public sense, one of my things was to disavow people of the stories that they had come to believe and get them down to some of the facts. But archaeology in the public sense here is to create that broad social network, and we've worked systematically to do that in Casco Bay and within the region. And I think that currency is of great value for preservation and education.
It's a long-term commitment, so we didn't just go there, dig, and then go home. We spent a lot of time there in the community, years there. They know who we are, we know who they are.
Was part of that experience of spending the time in the community, building up that trust, did that help you in making the community of Phippsburg comfortable with your work, and knowing that this was once a very controversial island?
Yeah, well, certainly we had people from the community volunteering to go out with us on the island. One of the waitresses at the restaurant where we ate said, "Oh, can I go?" So we took her out onto the island. A lot of the folks have gone on tours because when they saw that this is not really exploitative, that we're seriously studying this and gathering information. And I think the current generation, whenever there is something that's kind of secretive in the past, there's a benefit when you sort of get that information out. Then you find out, well, it wasn't really so bad. It's like the archaeology here showed us these were folks just like the rest of us trying to get by and earn a living.
I'm pretty sure that, given my family history in Casco Bay from the earliest 1600s, and knowing a lot of the landscape for years of working here, that was very helpful and beneficial. I do recall Rob and I gave a talk at Bowdoin College a number of years ago about the subject, and 110 people showed up. And one of the guys walked up was Arthur Pierce, and I asked him about his family history, and he said, "Well, my families are Alexanders," and I said, "So am I." And those types of things, I think, just open the door a little bit. But the real key thing that I think that both of us feel is taking people out to the island and having them touch objects and look at things that relate to their family's past and their heritage. The dimension of confidence in the community, without not putting on rose-colored glasses, there's a lot of people that just don't want to deal with the subject. It's still a controversial subject. But the facts have now changed about the nature of this mixed race fishing community. And a lot of the negative stereotypes and negative commentaries are now set back in time, and we're looking forward at people knowing who their family are and other things. And I think the communities embrace that in a fairly interesting way. But a lot of this, I mean, anybody that grew up in the 1960s that looked at the race riots and looked at those issues, most of my students don't know much about that. When you directly confronted that, you can see how far we've really come. And even over the 5 or 6 years of investment here and the 20 years of working with the site, we've come a long way, I think, in the community.
Right, people will approach us now and talk to us about it.
So for young people today, the thing is to look forward, look at a forward-thinking agenda. What can we learn from this, and how can we think about people in the future, treat the issues in the future, rather than just going back and reiterating a lot of those issues of the past.
When you began your research to do a dig like this, what do you need to start digging? What are you looking for as far as research goes?
Digging is sort of like the last thing that we do. Yeah, we do a whole lot of work first. We do a lot of interviews. We do a lot of archival research. We read about similar cases and sites in other areas. We spend, and we think of strategies. We do mapping. We do a lot of examination. We walk it over. We look at it. So long before we ever actually put anything in the ground, which we all, of course, love to do. But it is probably the actual excavation is, I don't know, maybe 10% of what archaeology does.
I think one of the key things behind this In reviewing Casco Bay, we looked at all of the cartography, air photos, landowners, maps, all of those types of things in historic documents, but then we got down to a piece that Bill Berry wrote at Maine Historical Society. You read something like that, it was very provocative. It had the photo documentation as a real active element of Maine Historical. That piece, Shameful Malaga, captured my attention. I'm like, let's go get this. Let's go find this. When we actually started doing some very basic ground truthing and going to the island, John Mosier and I were the first folks to set foot on the island in the late 80s relative to archaeology, and we walked up there and we looked at the bank and I'm like, can't be this easy. A big pile of shells and lots of things associated with the McKinney House and artifacts coming right out of the bank. So right away we could see that there was more research, as Rob's talking, to be done on the site than the just excavation. So I think there's an awful lot of people that are involved in this. Alan Breed became a very important individual because he had done lots of historic documentation. And all the things captured in this exhibit here get to the primary sources and the diversity of a real interdisciplinary approach to the past, which historic archaeology, I think, embraces significantly.
So when you do get to the digging and the fun part that everybody likes, and you're unearthing all of these fragments, can you please describe the cataloging and research process that happens at that point?
Lots of bags. Bags, markers. Yeah, we label things and we collect things from certain areas, we sort them out so that we know, we can look at this and say, who found this? What day did they find it? What part of the site did they find it in? How deep was it? All of that stuff gets recorded with it in the container that is, and then the individual artifacts are later labeled with a catalog number that can be keyed back into that information. We can put that on a computer, we can manipulate that, we can use that to draw diagrams, and we can use that to look at statistics and all kinds of studies. So the important thing is knowing where these things are in relationship to themselves and to other things.
When we first started out here in earnest, after Maine Coast Heritage Trust acquired the island, we used a global positioning system, Tremble High Resolution, to build the boundaries of the site. And then we used a total station, which gives you three-dimensional electronic Cartesian coordinates. So we built a surface map of the location of the units. I think right now when you actually ask a question like that, you think about the recovery and the processing. One of the key points I'd have for young people or anyone relative to the site is that we've dug about 2% of the site or less. There's lots of archaeological matrix there, millions of artifacts, majority of them pedestrian, still in the ground. And we've sampled little areas that were fairly strategic within the site. We did process all the materials at the University of Southern Maine in environmental archaeology and lab classes that Rob and I participated in. And then those materials were archivally bagged. And as of a couple of weeks ago, the majority of those materials are being accessioned into the Maine State Museum. So the process of cataloging and recovery has to include all the documentation all the way through to getting into the State Museum with proper archival documentation, things that I think are important. So the process is time consuming. There's a lot of energy that goes into it.
So we use surveying and mapping material just like when they put up a new building and they lay out where everything is going to be. So we're sort of like reversing that back to how things were originally laid out. So there's enough information there to do all that. And that's in addition to all the labeling of the artifacts and such. And they'll be there for years and years.
There's one wonderful aspect of the site. This is so much fun, and I think anybody that really does historic archaeology goes, how did you get to be so lucky? We have a photograph of a building that we can go out and still see the landforms, the bedrock, the configuration of the landscape, and say, that's where this house sat. So Rob walked around pointing to the photograph, holding it, and I'm taking pictures like, that's right where the McKinney House was. That's right where the Griffin House was. And in that sense, to be able to isolate that and to do the work and be strategic about where your dig was was particularly fun, and it's unusual. It's unusual.
And you're not just cataloging artifacts and fragments. It sounds like there's also some environmental dirt samples and soil samples that you're also going through. So I was also wondering, what did you learn about the environmental history of the island and how that impacted life on the island?
Well, you're right, and an important part of it is we took samples that we're not even going to analyze yet. We're just setting them aside because sometime in the future someone might have a particular technique that we don't have, or might have a question that we're not asking right now, so that we've taken samples at different layers down in the island and set those aside. And then some of them we've taken and we've analyzed so that we can look at the soil chemistry and we can look at, is there contamination there, other things, and we can reconstruct what are the environmental conditions. We can look at the seeds that people have, what kind of evidence of plants that were on the island. Then we look at the current vegetation that's there now and work backwards. Like, for example, it was interesting to find out that they were growing hops. And I have to confess that we actually made beer from those hops, and it came out pretty good. So, and those hops are one of those, they're a cultivar, so that once they're planted, they'll survive afterwards. There are other plants like rhubarb that will do that on the site. So we saw some, and we saw some berries there, and we saw there's a red spruce forest there, and that forest is relatively, the trees are all relatively the same age, which tells us that they kind of got their start at about the same time when people moved off the island, and so there was less disturbance on those trees. So we can look at the current trees and figure out what was there in the past, and we can look at the archaeology and let that tell us about what was there.
We got a lot of environmentally specific pieces of data from the ground. We got terrestrial land snails, little land snails that don't live in a tile, they live on the land. And we floated those out of the soil by just immersing them into water. And we got a whole host of varieties. Cionella lubrica is the Latin name for them. And we got some of them that were very specific to where a garden had grown. And you could see ones that loved particular types of species, so you can infer what the environment looked like 100 years ago, 150 years ago. We also got marine gastropods, or marine snails, common periwinkle, smooth periwinkle. And one of the tremendous environmental details, and this is like really significant, is we found a very discrete layer in which you have Littorina littorea going down to that point, but not below that point. And that point is about 1890. That's presumed to be an invasive species into the Gulf of Maine, but there is no Littorina littorea below that level into the 1870s, 1860s, and any of the household areas. So we presume that it was first came to the island then. The obtusata, it changes its morphology. The shell becomes thicker, a little bit more robust, as it is preyed upon by green crab. And green crab makes its way to Casco Bay, in the northern part of Casco Bay, somewhere like around 1900 to 1905. So the morphology of shells and the presence of shells indicate predator-prey and past environments and what they were doing. There's a lot of bone. We got 20,000 pieces of bone, great variety of bird bones or fish bones, swordfish, for example, which is the most recent archaeological occurrence of swordfish. And the bird bones themselves tell a story about the environment because the people were preying upon the birds. The bird feathers and the wings commanded a premium for the hat market and the feather trade, something that the Audubon Society, as it was reforming and growing, nationally grabbed a hold of. In an environmental sense, you can see large groups of birds being taken, and quite a variety of them, probably for people to supplement their income in this coastal setting. But in an regional environmental history, the bird population, the shellfish, all of these things are significant. A student at Bates College this semester took the bivalve, soft-shell clams, and cut them to look at seasons of procurement, when they were actually harvesting them, which gets to the direct written historic record. What we've got is a great environmental set of data that will be used for a number of years and will still produce some fairly significant results. I think that's, of all the things we do, the public archaeology is part of it, and the museum exhibit is really wonderful. But for Rob and I, the protracted stuff that we're interested in are the proxy data, the stuff that comes out of the ground and how you can infer and strengthen an understanding of the environment. To have an 1860 to 1910 component this rich in archaeology is wonderful. His colleague Joe Staples also did some great environmental work on insects and the habitat of the island.
Right. And we, in summary too, these folks were using everything that was on that island. And
Yes.
in the context of using everything, the things we find about that help us to understand what the environment was like and how they interacted with it.
So what did you learn from this project that you're going to take and apply to future projects?
The importance of networking and collaborating, the idea of a long-term commitment. This thing became larger than we had hoped because of so many people coming forward about it. We were thrilled when this person, Kate, wanted to come see us and do an exhibit on this. And we were amazed at that. That was awesome for us. So I think we learned to jump right out and keep having faith and try these things and recognize that if we build out the different connections to them, other people can see them and do good things with them.
As a faculty member in a state university and having grown up here in the state of Maine and listened to a lot of people's values about education and about the state government, one of the things that was absolutely key for me is to be able to work on a piece of property represented by a significant land trust in the state, a land trust that covers the coast and has values with many different groups, folks that are involved in interest of birds and plants, to start to incorporate cultural heritage into what they do as they build more walking trails and get out into that landscape, as we engage it more and still have a value to be outdoors. To take that from the land trust through the university to educate a whole host of interesting students, and then to get a full commitment from the Maine State Museum to put together the exhibit, to curate the materials, to make those materials available to other institutions, that's for me is one of the most significant aspects. And it's what do you learn? You learn that this can work. And there's a lot of divergent views on where stuff should be and how it should operate. And I've dealt with that all of my life where people say, oh, it goes to the museum and it goes in a drawer. There's an exhibit here. We're in the information age. There'll be things posted like this that people can actually use. But I look at the ability to maintain this stuff in perpetuity and for other people to be able to work with it as being one of the most significant elements. To be able to reinforce that and actually have that happen is a key aspect of the stewardship and the preservation initiative.
Despite the fact that there was nobody here that was famous, no big battle was fought here, this is common people, our own folks in our own families, other people's families. So to us, that's really interesting that we can take the time to appreciate something that's basic like that to us as a society.
Although I don't imagine 30 years ago people were thinking of the Mass 54, thinking of the Black Regiment that served in the Civil War, but there's people involved in the island and the community here that were part of that. So as people, I look at it this way. When we first started this project, I was interested in African American history in Maine. Like there wasn't a whole lot of that when I was growing up here. And I thought, if we could capitalize on something that's highly visible like this, what it opens the doors for other scholars to come along and work with other sites in the landscape. It builds a broader appreciation of the diversity of the people in the state of Maine. I've concentrated a lot of attention on Native American heritage. There's many other cultural groups that can be incorporated in, and there's a strong Native presence at the island as well.
Now that the conversation has shifted to the people that are who these people were,
Yep.
And we know that the descendants have been very interested in the exhibit, and I'm sure they were very interested in your work on the island as well. Can you talk about how the descendants have responded to the archaeology work on Malaga Island?
That's actually been pretty impressive because originally, there's a hesitation and then they find out, well, we're coming back, we're here the next year, and we're here the next year, and then they start to come and talk to us. But I think when we did the talks, I think that really helped too, because a lot of folks would go like, hey, they're interested in this, and there are other people that are sharing this information. And so we see something that shifts into pride.
It's been very interesting on the island having folks from the McKinney family come out and look at me and they say, you're not talking about the things that I was said when I was a kid, when I was growing up. You're talking about this in a whole different set of terms. And I'm like, well, I'm an anthropologist charged with all of these words and jargon. But what it gets down to when you look at the individuals is, this is where my family's house was. And I think of how many people, whether they're young or old, at some point reflect on who their parents and grandparents and get into genealogy and try to find the old family home or farm or something along those lines. People explore their roots. There is a very clear and conscious ability for people to explore their roots with a not demeaning, degrading self-attitude, but a new sense of pride and excitement of finding other people that they're related to. And to watch that happen, I talk about this in my class. This is the intangible. There's no personnel evaluation for this kind of stuff. Went to the Salt Institute. Rob Rosenthal, Kate Philbrick did a wonderful exhibit there. We had a photograph of some folks. Woman says, gee, I'd like to see I'd like to see the McKinney woman. And I said, well, there's a photograph. She looked and said, I've never seen that picture. To stand there and just watch them look at that and be reflective, it'd be like me looking at a family member I've never seen a photo of, but in a different kind of way, very curious way. And have somebody stand right next to them and said, I'm a McKinney too. And they're looking at each other and they're just getting to know each other. And there's another boy right behind him who says, all right, now I know who your relatives are. This is who I'm related to. And I thought, this is wonderful. The idea of actually having an archaeology with a living descendant community is not different than Native Americans. Usually we're dealing with a great time back. This is something that happened and charged people that they are tangible to and close to. And I think it's just a very interesting thing. You can politicize it and you can talk about it, but it's a great value to get to more identity.
With all that you've experienced on Malaga Island, is there one thing that surprised you the most that you found?
Well, I guess I was initially surprised at just how many thousands of things, how many thousands of artifacts there were there. I'd say that probably was my biggest surprise. But.
Yeah. There's no question that these guys built from the rock up. They created living surfaces and put the stuff in there. It's amazing the volume of material. Most of it is very pedestrian, nails, and the food remains. The thing that struck me, the thing that I like grabbed a hold of and was most impressive to me was, yeah, there's enough bone in here to really create an understanding of diet, of the marine conditions, enough things so that we can do chemistry and analysis on them to look at what the environment was like. I saw this as just a tremendous opportunity, not for me and not for Rob as much as the students and the people that will follow up and do the specialized analysis. But there's very cool little things in here. You're like, we've got to a layer with all kinds of children's things. This is where the school was. There's some kid stuff here. And as Kate and I have talked, there's a ring that's made out of ring made out of a brass shotgun shell. There's little things like that we look at it like, that's cool. That's wicked cool. It's interesting. And there's things that absolutely contradict the governor and the governor's council. And you have the hope that all of this stuff is going to be straightforward. The truth will set you free. Sometimes it'll hurt. Rob's finding the wells.
Yes.
The water wells, right?
Yes.
We're like, okay, there's a well, it's got water, it's charged. There's another well, it's got water charged. I think these were supposed to exist. Well, there's 6 or 7 of them. Yeah. So in a sense, it's all of archaeology involves that discovery. When you open the ground, you have an idea of what you're going to get. You can be a very well-informed idea, and then you get stuff, and you're like, what's this? There's some very high status, interesting things. There's some older things. I love to listen to people try to interpret it because, interpretation sometimes is based on good judgment. Sometimes it's just purely conjecture. Anything exciting for you?
You know, a lot of the things that we found supported what we thought we might find, which was these were folk living, with children, cooking, cleaning, sewing. So we found a lot of the stuff associated with that we expected to find. But I don't think we quite, it got to the point where we'd look at Button Bay and we'd go, okay, have you found your button yet? If you don't find your button within the first 10 minutes, you're not qualified. So there was just so many things there to find, and that the idea you could just reach down. I think the first time I was on the site, I looked at when I picked up an Indian head penny.
Yes.
Now that would have been, so of course now I'm thinking, oh, so I'm going to make money on this site. I think we made what, 12 cents?
12 cents.
But I'm going like, wow, this is going to be easy. Of course, that was the only one that I found, but I think it's surprising to take this place that has no one on it and then realize that this was a community, and we reconstruct it in our heads, and we do that when we take people on tours.
The other thing that you're talking about, surprise, we got to the bottom of the site and we dug right into that lower level, and there's prehistoric material under it. That's something we expected, but there it is.
It's a surprise even when you expect it, yeah.
There's one thing that I found was one of the most interesting and absolutely fun things about the island. We used a coring device between Bear Island and Malaga at the lowest part of the tide. We went out cored and drove these rods down, and we got to a buried shell layer, then we got to a forest floor. So we could actually see that sometime like 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, the islands were connected together. We're at the forest. That environmental stuff for me is very important. It's beyond the scope of what's happening at Malaga, and it's the next door that we probably will open. I walk around with Rob, and he's like looking at cut trees, and he's like, this is where the road was. He has a knowledge of the landscape and the environment that, I think we learned a lot from each other, and I think that is wonderful.
Well, we're dealing with environmental change and sea level rise, so this kind of understanding of how past environments were and how people adapted or used them is going to be even more important as we deal with change that's our folks watching this. It will be in their lifetime, but they'll have to deal with some significant.
There's just as many people living on the Maine coast today, and just as hard a conditions as these guys were living, trying to make a living with 2 or 3 kids and very low income in a marginal, harsh environment.
Do you have any future plans for continuing your Malaga Island research?
We're in a point where we are taking and continuing to analyze the collections and continuing to write up and document our results. And we may have some more questions that might lead to some other exploration, which is kind of an interesting thing, and that is that kids can do this. You do not have to be a college student. You do not have to have a degree. As long as you work with someone who can supervise and know what you're doing, there can be good archaeology done in the field by middle school students. So we will keep in mind that there can be a wider audience now that might want to come and be involved the next time we do this.
Yeah, I have some interest in some future goals. I'd like to continue doing the summer tours with Maine Coast Heritage Trust and taking people up to the island. I think it's a special cultural landscape to be able to walk people through. And I anticipate that USM students and Bates College students will be able to work more with the environmental samples so we can do some proxy evidence and look at environmental change. I also am charged with George Lane's scrapbook that's in the exhibit here. There's 9 other communities on the Maine coast. Some of them mixed race, some of them of Black heritage, and I'd like to go find those other 9 communities and get some of our former undergrads or current undergrads or other grad students to come out and do some more work here in the state of Maine. One of our students, Kate McMahon, who finished American and New England Studies, focused on Warren, Maine, and Peterborough, the biggest Black community in the state, and historic Black community in the state. Now she's at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and she's going to do more with that community. I think what Rob and I are like, we're catalysts, and we've fused opportunities. We're creating opportunities and agenda for students of the future. And I think one of the key things for us is to do the environmental work and to really publish something substantial on this so that there's materials for people to do follow-up on. Kate was talking about doing a catalog of the exhibit here, and I think that those things will be useful and important things in the future. It's interesting how much hangs on this one site because of the challenging journalism of the end of the last century, the early part of this century. If people hadn't been offensive, if the eugenics movement hadn't gone forward as strong as it had, and if people hadn't been poor on the Maine coast, it wouldn't have had the color that it does. But a whole lot of conjunctions came together, and I think we're going to capitalize on those to make sure this doesn't happen again, but to show what really did happen there.
And the island, it belongs to Maine Coast Heritage Trust, and we would be interested in knowing and honoring and responding to questions they might have as they continue to promote us going on the island and providing an interpretation and walks and things like that.
You build opportunities for preservation. You have the National Register. This is part of the Freedom Trail. You build these opportunities, and then you have to sustain the opportunity. You have to, and as this infrastructure gets bigger, it gets to be challenging. I would like to work with Maine Coast Heritage Trust and other students to capitalize on other pieces of their property that have cultural sites on them to make some of that knowledge accessible to the public. It creates a sense of value of archaeology, a value of the past, that it's not just the artifacts, it's the environmental data. You go back past 100 years, and a lot of that environmental data is hard to get to, and archaeology offers a direct approach to the past. And I know that people are concerned with whether we're going to have a drought in Ohio next summer, but we're still looking at the past 100, 200, 300 years.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your insight and for coming and talking to us and our visitors, our public, and really appreciate all the work that you've put into the island and helping us with the exhibit here at the museum as well.
I'd like to make one last comment if I could.
Absolutely.
Having grown up and gone to school here in Maine, I encourage folks to look very carefully at the opportunities in their schools and to look for opportunities around archaeology, mainly the Maine Archaeological Society, and also to come to the Maine State Museum and see the exhibit and to think about what they might be able to do with higher education and college. There's some tremendous opportunities, and there's some wonderful people out here to be mentors for young people.
Come up and say hi to us.
Yeah, we're
Wonderful.
accessible.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.